I recently had the honor of appearing as a guest speaker at Ryman Arts, a specialized education program for high school students here in Los Angeles, California. I was asked to give a presentation about my path and entire career thus far as an artist. It covers my early education, to my years in art college, to the first jobs I held after art college, and I share here how I even got into animation in the first place. So if you are curious to know more of my backstory and what a 20-year-long career as a full-time artist can look like, then I invite you to watch this presentation. Well, I'm honored to have been invited here as a guest speaker, and I have a comprehensive presentation that shows pretty much like a little bit of everything for my career of like the last 20 years. So I'll get right into it. So yes, I'm Terry Hendrick, and a little bit of my background. I grew up in a suburb of Los Angeles County called Glendora with my family. My parents weren't necessarily artists, but they did have creative hobbies, and they were supportive of me pursuing the arts. Although I didn't really get serious about my art career until I started high school. And by serious, all that meant was that I chose an art class for an elective throughout each year of high school. And so won't spend too much time here, but I wanted to share some of the work that I was making when I was your age. So a lot of what I did is I would find photographs that I liked, and I would copy them and create them in my kind of exploring different styles, and also different materials and techniques. So that's a photograph I had referenced, and then also just playing with different ideas. This was like a watercolor and using type to render an image. And I was also really into bands and music then, and this is like my interpretation of the Smashing Pumpkins. I also drew the lead singer a lot, so this was kind of playing with the technique and like pastel material. I was also really into anime, and I would create my own anime character. So this is something I created. This is like color pencil. Another character I created. So my senior year of high school, a recruiter from ArtCenter came, and in speaking with them, I felt like, okay, I'll likely want to attend ArtCenter for my college. But it did sound like intense, because it made it sound like you had to be ready to hit the ground running when you start college there. And I felt like I still wanted to kind of explore and like make sure like I was 100% confident, like illustration was what I wanted to study, because there's always like slightly different fields of art. So instead of going straight to a four-year college, I decided instead to attend community college, which was Mount San Antonio College. And I was definitely kind of like the odd one out of my class to choose to do that, since most of my classmates in high school, like they were already applying to like UCLA and USC. So I had to kind of make the conscious decision of like, no, I'm just gonna take some time to explore. And I'm still really like proud and grateful that I made that choice, just because for one thing, community college is like way more affordable, but like the education there is still great. Like a lot of instructors will like hop around and work both at a like private college and community college, so still great instruction. And I just had the freedom to like study whatever I wanted. So I was still into anime then, and giving myself the leeway to study what I wanted. I actually studied like Japanese language while I was at Mount SAC. But yeah, just doing more art for myself. These are some anime characters I just created on my own. And also a big fan of Sailor Moon, and then exploring using type again in image making. And then some classes I took at community college were photography. So this was like a traditional photography class where I was actually in a lab developing film. That's a self-portrait from that class. And this was using like infrared film. And I also took a fashion illustration class. So I kind of learned to exaggerate figures, and also kind of different rendering techniques to depict different types of fabric. So all work I did there at Mount SAC. I did take other classes, and these pieces in particular are pieces that I recall using for my entrance portfolio to ArtCenter. Pretty sure I used acrylic and exploring kind of more sort of like occult, like magical themes was something I was into and sort of still am into. And these were works that I also used in my entrance portfolio that were like the style was inspired by different illustrators I had found, but kind of creating my own like ideas and imagery. And so after like 2.5 years at community college, I was actually there long enough to earn my associate's degree. I did get accepted into ArtCenter, and as I said, I really thought about what exactly I would focus on for my major. So it was editorial illustration major and a minor in fine art, because I kind of debated like, oh, should I make fine art my major? But happy again that I took like the time to like really think about it, and I'm happy that's what I chose to do. So showing some of the early work in ArtCenter. This is like foundational work. Everyone has to go through like a materials class. So learning just sculpting and finishing and form. Then also traditional drawing classes. This was a kind of ink and pen drawing that I had done in class that I really liked. And also oil painting. And so now in ArtCenter, we were definitely encouraged more to use our own reference. So I actually kind of went out and took my own photos, had like a friend help me, and then made a painting from this. And still into kind of music and celebrities, and so I'd often kind of use them as templates for my work. So this was a triptych I made for a figure painting class. This was a work for like a more, I think, experimental illustration class, using more stylistic techniques and kind of laying things out like a storyboard to create a narrative. And then I would also just make found object pieces, which were also part of my illustration classes, and it was used to basically create an image for a story. And this one in particular was about kind of crossing the border and like the dangers of that. And then, yeah, this is more like experimental illustration work, I believe. And this was done in class using kind of with models, live models for reference. And the teacher really kind of encouraged us to kind of like let us be expressive, and this piece I would say felt kind of like a breakthrough piece for me, and like even the teacher was like, wow, that's great. And so I was inspired to make more pieces like it. This is a self-portrait I made, and this, I made a few of these like this that were made on unstretched canvas, so I would just put the canvas up against the wall and with acrylic paint, and also I had like found like pattern papers like from the art store and kind of use that for the bottom half. So yeah, I was into this kind of looser technique, and I used the same kind of reference photo for this work, which is for a different illustration class, and that was again exploring using type to create an image. And so this image is made using ones and zeros, like binary code. And I also had a printmaking class, and again exploring kind of creating graphic shapes with type. And so early on in ArtCenter, like pretty much each kind of term, I had to sign up to like figure drawing or figure painting, but I never felt like that was my thing, or it never like came naturally to me. But then halfway through ArtCenter, I took a landscaping class. And once I took that class, that's when it seems like things clicked, and I was like, okay, I think maybe the reason I'm not so great with figure drawing is because I'm way better with landscape painting. So this was actually a work I did like in one of the first classes of that landscape painting class, where we just had to use black and white paint, and we would go out into nature for the class and like just spend kind of our class time there, rendering different spots. And what helped was that the teacher really encouraged us to like time ourselves and only spend so much like time on a painting. So by doing that, you're like really forced to then figure out like, okay, this is what's the most important part, so this is what I need to render in like maybe like the 10 minutes I have to make this. And I have a few other examples. Again, we would just go different places around LA and paint. So these were made like on like little like 4x6 watercolor blocks using, I believe, like gouache paint. And these were works I made kind of like, I believe maybe for the final of that class, and these were oil paintings I had done on my own. And you know, each term in ArtCenter, you had the opportunity to apply for a scholarship. And you do that by like putting, you know, like your work up on the wall and it gets evaluated. So at this point, I placed up a lot of my landscape work for that scholarship opportunity. I didn't get that, but a like faculty member from like, you know, an English teacher saw the work on the wall and contacted me saying, hey, I really like your pieces, you know, can I purchase like some? So it was from that landscaping class that I actually sold some of my very first like artworks. So that definitely like confirmed like, okay, I think landscape painting might be my thing. But even after, you know, that class, I still had other classes I had to make, you know, fulfill assignments for. And I used my mom a lot as reference just because like she was around and there. So this was a painting I had made of her. And this is a larger scale artwork that I believe I had made for a fine art class. And it was done in oil paint. And I think after making this, I was kind of satisfied, like, okay, I can render, you know, an imagined scene, but I was more interested in stylized work. So after this, I then kind of went into more, I guess, editorial illustration type looks. And so here, again, playing around with using type to kind of be part of the image. I don't know that that was actually successful here because I kind of felt like the type makes her look furry, but in making it, that then informed me of like, okay, well now I know a better way I can use this. So then I used that piece to then make this kind of mock-up illustration cover where I use like type to kind of create the kind of fluffy sweater he's wearing. And I was also into combining different techniques. So I guess like mixed media. So I was not only like using, I believe like marker, but also spray paint. I would actually like cut out stencils and do spray paint. And like the cover was painted with acrylic. And so around here, this is like now like the last half of ArtCenter. I did feel like my personal style was starting to emerge, and like with these like flat colors, and also like mixing different techniques. So like having like a hyper rendered like bird, but then like the face is like more stylistic with like hash marks, and then combining it with like thread. And I was also into like the language of instruction manuals and kind of like how like they communicate to you how to do something. I was like, oh, I can use that to communicate like just different ideas or emotions or, you know, whatever illustration. This was actually of a band, and I made this on acrylic on wood panel. And my paintings then were like super flat. This is actually a silk screen, but using the same technique or stylistic technique of like flat background with like, you know, instruction type like arrows and simplistic figures. And this one's called like, I think Days of Our Wives. But yeah, if I showed you the acrylic painting, some people when they've seen these works, they're like, oh, that looks like a computer printout because it's just super flat. A lot of like just layering of acrylic paint to make sure like the paint is as like flat as possible. And so, okay, this is now end of ArtCenter. This is an opportunity I came across through two friends of mine. We worked together collaboratively on this like mural project for the Adidas office in Santa Monica. And so each of us took like a part of it and put our own spin on it. So like I was the one who kind of came up with like having instructions on like how to tie your shoe. But then also like the rendering techniques we also each had a part of, and we made it together for the office. So now, my early art career after graduating ArtCenter. So I was focused on editorial illustration, and I did get to do some of those jobs. This was a piece I did for an airline magazine. And you can see by then, like I had a very like clear defined style so that if an art director hired me, they kind of knew what to expect. And I also got to do the cover image for one of ArtCenter's alumni newsletters. This is another editorial illustration like for a UK magazine. And here I'm using, those were actually kind of a combination of spray paint and then like acrylic. And I also made works for myself. So this is acrylic painting. And some of these paintings that I did for myself would end up getting shown in group shows. So this one, for example, was shown at a show and sold. But between like the editorial work and then also selling some work in galleries, basically the pay wasn't always consistent, or was kind of like unpredictable. And I felt like, okay, I just need a full-time job. So I ended up at a architectural illustration firm in Pasadena. And at this job, the artists had to just create renderings of homes that were going to be built. And we'd use different styles of rendering based on whatever the client wanted. So yeah, that other one was like a little more painterly, and this is kind of like more of a sketched, like ink and pencil type look, or yeah, just black and white. And we would work with a team of artists where there were like two artists who knew how to use the program CAD, which is where like you make like the official architectural drawings, and they would render out the very basic line art. And then they would give that line art to the artist, and we'd have to fill in all the details, even into like the texturing and like the siding was things like I would have to add. And then of course all the color and like the foliage. And some of this we'd grab from like a library and drop it in, because we'd have to essentially just pump these out, like as many as we could make a day. That was our job. I mean, this is a little more, takes a little more work, the 3D rendering. More stylized, like an entire neighborhood. But I learned a lot of valuable kind of techniques from this job, because in ArtCenter, like back then, like learning Photoshop wasn't a huge focus, and learning it or using it on the job was much more valuable here. And I kind of learned how, different shortcuts and different kind of tools that were available for me. And that became really useful later on in my career. And we occasionally did like floor plans, which were kind of fun because, some of these things, they like, maybe like a plant or like a chair, there would be like a library of those things, and I would just drop them in. But occasionally there were things that like weren't in the library, and I'd have to like render it from scratch. Another drawing, or I guess we call these like elevations, I think is what we call them. But yeah, something like this, like we'd be making these like within like an hour. Like it was all very programmed out of like, okay, this is the color, this is the texture you're using. So yeah, became very efficient working in Photoshop. Okay, so after that job, I took like a little bit of a break. I was actually at that job right as the housing market was kind of about to burst. So that affected the work there, and they were beginning to lay people off, but I left before they could lay me off. Took a little break, and then I came back to LA and started working at this giftware company in Covina. And so they had worked with Disney license products. And the way that kind of works at these companies is that, companies like Disney create these style guides like once a year that have like different patterns and colors and like different poses of characters. And then they send these out to their licensees, and then artists there take those to kind of create product ideas using them. So I'm not only like designing the products, I'm also even in Photoshop kind of rendering like what does this pen even look like, and creating essentially like template designs in Photoshop so that other artists could use them as well. And also kind of, we'd have to make informational sheets like for the manufacturer so they know like, okay, this is where you're supposed to print this color. And like product mock-ups. So yeah, a lot of the kind of giftware that they would sell are kind of things you'd kind of find at big box stores, and also creating packaging, imaging as well. And so yeah, so I'd use those style guides and then kind of compose like whatever product idea the like my boss had of like, hey, we want to make a set of like these extravagant pins, like use these like style guides to make them. So do, yeah, from the designing to laying out on the product sheet. And so they would then use these product sheets to, I guess, send to the buyers of these stores and say like, hey, we can make these like lines of pins, like, are you interested? Like, how many do you want to buy? So yeah. And the product they made the most were actually these like water globes, snow globes. And it was always fun to see kind of whatever I had designed, like created like in person. So that's like a product sample of one of my designs. These are more elaborate snow globes that I helped to design. And this was probably like one of the much more elaborate designs I had made. And this was like a combination of like using parts of like the style guide, but then also kind of finding like little, images online of like maybe like cupcakes and like cookies, and just putting it together into like a rendered idea for a product. And they actually did make a sample out of it. I don't know that they ever sold it in stores, because it was pretty like, there are lots of parts to it to make, but it was still kind of cool to see in person. This was like another like similar one where kind of snow globes within snow globes kind of idea. And that was like the sample that they made from it. So although I was working full time, I was still putting myself out there as an editorial illustrator. And this was a freelance job that I had booked. So basically I'd work my full-time job and then go home and work on this job, which was doing all the illustrations for this kind of novelty book. So those are some of the inner pages. These were all done, I believe, in Photoshop. But yeah, they hired me because they liked the instruction style I was using for my personal artwork. So I was working that gift work company job, but the pay wasn't great, and I was kind of just keeping my eye out of like, okay, there has to be like something out there that I could, do that maybe pays a little better, maybe a little more fulfilling. And a friend of mine called me while I was working that gift work company and said like, hey, I just was part of animated pilot, and they're actually going to pick up the show and produce it into a series. So they need more artists. And they initially called me because they wanted someone else's like number. And I was like, hey, actually, I'd be interested too. So could you put my name in? And that's how I landed my first animation job, which was The Life and Times of Tim, which was aired on HBO. And it was like an adult comedy. And the creator of the show actually wanted people on the crew who were not familiar with animation, because he wanted this like naive look to everything. So although I knew how to like properly like render and draw people, like this was his style of like kind of a naive kind of feel to it. So, and on that job, it was unconventional because I was, as an artist, had to kind of do a little bit of everything, that whatever they needed to see on screen, I would have to draw it and color it, which normally with animated jobs, like it's much more segmented and divided out. I'll get into that. But for this job, yeah, I actually drew these characters and colored them, and I actually like drew myself into the show, just like as an extra. And we'd also have to do props, and props are anything that like a character interacts with and that will have to move on screen. And even drew out like the different poses, which normally that's also a whole other position, like you wouldn't necessarily be doing just as a designer. Normally this is something that actual like animator would be figuring out, but we actually did that on the show and then handed it to the animators to kind of program in their animation program. So after that job, the way kind of work in animation, or at least TV animation, is that you kind of get hired for like the run of a season, and like if it gets picked up for another season, then you have more work, but it's kind of like off and on. So there was a stretch where I was, before I get into that, some other work still from that show. So I did also backgrounds, drawing and painting, and we'd also have to even compose everything into the scene. So normally it's not so involved. When you get hired onto animation, you're usually just like doing one very specific thing. But it was nice to kind of be exposed to all these different responsibilities. So then it's like, okay, well, I guess I kind of like doing backgrounds the most. So that's what I decided to focus on more. But going back to what I was saying is I still had some like breaks in between kind of animation work. So I would go back to my own like painting. And so this is like an artwork I had made, acrylic. And like the snow was actually done with spray paint. So I actually like cut out a stencil for like the snow on this painting. And some of these work were, shown in gallery group shows and sold. And I also drew, I had like a sketch, like just a Google Blogger place where I would post up drawings, like sketch drawings that I would make. And this was even before like social media was like that big, so I really didn't know who was even looking at that blog. But the drawings on the right I had done of like a celebrity chef who appeared on Top Chef. And so I posted up on my blog, and I think he must have had like a Google alert for his name, because like within a day of posting it, like he contacted me and said, I want to buy that sketch. So yeah, that was pretty wild. But I want to share that story just because like you never know who's going to like see your art and who's also going to be like, who's it going to appeal to? Because like to me, like these were just like rough sketches. Like it's not even like a finalized kind of painting, but they still really wanted it. So always worth putting your art out there. This was an official freelance job that I had, which was like creating these kind of concept renderings of a proposed theme park somewhere in Asia, and I drew these all by hand with pencil, and that was a fun job. And then, this is an editorial illustration work that I got to do, and I really liked being able to do like these pieces in particular, especially when it was attached to like a meaningful story. But then I got hired back into a new animation job, and this was kind of much more like official because it was actually at an animation studio called Titmouse. And I was hired on to that job through someone I knew at the architectural illustration firm. Like they went on to work in animation, and I kind of ran across them randomly, and they're like, hey, I'm working at the studio now, you want to come by for lunch? And I did. And in touring the studio, we just happened to find a production that was in need of a background artist. So that's how I got this opportunity. And on this show, I was doing both the background design and the painting of backgrounds. And I did that for the first season. And this was called, the show was Brandy Cunningham 9th Grade Ninja. And it aired on like Disney, I don't know. It was like not, I mean, now it's probably on Disney Plus, but back then it was on some cable version of Disney. And so by the second season though, the art director had me focus only on the painting of the backgrounds. So this is an example where someone else came up with like the layout and like kind of drew the line art, but then they gave it to me to finish out with like the color and the lighting. And this is another example where I did all the paint work for this background. And then from that show, I was then hired to work at this other studio called ADHD, which doesn't exist now, but there I was again doing both the line art and the color, and we were using, I had to use the program Adobe Animate to make these backgrounds. And I included on these what the storyboard looked like, which is on the upper left corner, because that's what I would be given as a background designer. And you kind of can see from the storyboard, it just kind of roughly lays out maybe like the perspective and where things generally are. But as a background designer, your responsibility is filling in all the details and figuring out like, well, like what exactly is on top of the fridge, or what is in this corner of like the kitchen, and like, you know, like what type of chairs do they have? So those are the decisions you're making as a designer. And then, you know, the other part of it is the color and figuring out where's all the lighting gonna fall. So after this show, I was then hired back to Titmouse and worked on a series of Hot Wheels films. And for this job, I was only doing the painting. So someone else drew all this, but then I figured out all the colors and the lighting. And I wanted to show kind of this grouping because it's pretty common as like an artist or designer to be given the responsibility of like, you're gonna depict different shots of the same location, just because like usually it makes it easier to be consistent of like, okay, well, on this kind of the wide shot, like I colored the tops of those like purple, and then like on the down shot, like I know like what color that is. So yeah, kind of showing different shots of the same location. Okay, so one cool thing working at Titmouse is once a year they have something called 5-second day, where they let artists for like one work day do whatever they want, and they call it 5-second day just because you can only make like 5 seconds of animation with like 8 hours of work. And I also at that studio, by the way, that's where I met my husband, and so we worked together on a few shorts whenever 5-second day came around. And then they made this like a big deal. Like they actually would show our like whatever animation we made, they would show it like at a theater. It was called like the 5-second day screening. But because of participating in that, the like studio heads were like, hey, we want to like promote you to direct these series of shorts. So got to direct on this program. It's called like, I think History of the World for Now. Sometimes these titles change, and like the working title changes from like what it'll be in reality. But so I got to do like everything, like involved from the very beginning. And so did both the design and the paint, and even helped with designing the character. This was like another scene from that short series. And so yeah, got to draw the background and paint it all in Photoshop, and then also worked with a team of animators to like make it come to life, and they made like all the flames move in the scene. Also with that job, like we had each kind of animated short we were responsible for, they wanted, like the creators wanted a different look to each one. So this is like still the same job, but like just a different short. And I also just did everything from drawing the background to even designing the character and the colors. So after that job, I then moved to Bento Box Studio, which that's the animation studio that makes Bob's Burgers. The show I was hired to do was Legends of Chamberlain Heights, which aired on Comedy Central. And the creator of the show actually worked briefly on that HBO show, The Life and Times of Tim, and he kind of wanted that kind of sort of naive or sort of rough look for this show, which is probably why I was hired. And for this one, I was doing both background design and paint, and we even were doing like prop design and color as well. And we were using Toon Boom Harmony for this show. And so after this, I was then hired to do background paintings at WB on the show Bunnicula. And I was kind of hired as the show was actually ending. I was like the tail end of the third season. But it was still like a fun opportunity just because the style was just so different from anything I had done before. But I really liked being able to work in this very rendered style. It was definitely more involved because, you know, the background designers would give us like just line art for these backgrounds, but then the final look was supposed to be lineless. So as the painter, I'd have to like go in and almost like recreate every single shape in the program to then be able to render it out as if kind of giving it a 3D look. So yeah, more backgrounds from that show. And so from there, totally different style now. I was hired to work again as a painter, so didn't do the drawings here, but I did all the color and lighting. This was for an Adult Swim show called Hot Streets, and that was produced at Stupid Buddy Studios in Burbank, which they normally actually do a lot more stop motion, but they just happened to be hired to make this show. So another background from that show. I also, I didn't include it in the slideshow, but I did also help with like character and prop color as well. That position is called color design. And so, okay, so from that job, obviously just hopping around, basically once one season ends and you gotta find something else to do. So then I was hired to do background painting at Shadow Machine for the show Final Space. And I worked for 2 seasons on this show. And it's always fun when you're in a show that kind of goes to other worlds, so then you can kind of be really out there with the colors you use. And also wanted to mention, you know, everything I'm showing you here, like these are all just highlights, but like literally my portfolio, like, I mean, I have like hundreds of backgrounds from some of these shows because I was like, that's all you're doing all day is like painting backgrounds. Some spaceships I made, painted, and it's okay. So from here, well, there's, so that's me. And that's also like the tools we use. So we're usually on a Cintiq painting. And so at this point in my life, I was a new mom. I had a young child. And so between just working in animation and like having a family, like my personal painting practice was kind of a bit falling to the wayside, but whenever I had the opportunity, I would try and make a painting. So this is a piece I had made kind of during that time for myself, and really trying to find or like push for like a new style and not just going back to kind of the look I had before. So yeah, this is acrylic paint and also with like gold embossing. So, okay. But then I still had to focus on my animation career. And so after Final Space, I was promoted to work as a color supervisor back at Bento Box for the show Duncanville. And so for, you know, these pieces are a little bit more, it's like teamwork when you're working as a supervisor, since you're not always responsible for doing the actual like painting or color work. Although I did do most of the painting here. Since I was mostly having to help establish what does this location look like and like what are the colors are we going to use, and this was like a video game sequence in that show. And so after establishing it, then I would, you know, work with my team, and so like someone else like did the background painting there, but then I would also help figure out like what are the character colors and what's happening like when they have like a special effect. And as the supervisor, you know, being able to see the bigger picture of like, okay, well, this is what it's going to look like once it all comes together. So the top is actually what it looked like finalized on screen. And so this is a background painting I did do to kind of help establish a new location, and then I'd hand it off to the background painters to reference for like the other shots in that same location. And included, let's see, oops, okay. This was moving before and I don't know why it's not moving now. Well, anyways, another painting I had done for Duncanville. And okay, so after working on Duncanville, I was then given the opportunity to jump to another show at Bento Box that was starting up called Crepopolis. So I did work on as a color supervisor there and brought on like pretty early on to kind of help establish a lot of things. So this I did get to paint myself, and it was like one of the main locations where kind of a character has his lab in the palace. And one of the, I guess, cool challenges of the show is that since it's set in ancient Greece, there's like no artificial lighting. And so kind of working a lot with like natural light, and also then having to figure out what, you know, the firelight looks like and like what nighttime looks like. Like those are things I had to like decide as a color supervisor. And also with all these decisions, like creative decisions, is like making sure the process is realistic for like the artists to achieve like within like a, you know, a tight schedule. Because normally with a lot of television, you get 2 weeks to work on one episode. I mean, and you have a team like this show, I think had at least like 4 painters on it, but you're still having to like make roughly, I don't know, say estimate of like 50 backgrounds per episode. So between 4 people, you're like painting like 50 backgrounds. So yeah, trying to make sure like whatever style you kind of land on as the supervisor or the art director, that it's also achievable and realistic. So I also got to help, you know, figure out the colors of the main characters on the show. That's the main cast. And also in color, like we'd have to make creative decisions of like, okay, although the gods on the show, like the line art sort of looks like a human, they're still, you know, they're magical gods. And so a choice that I had made was using pure white for their clothing, but not using pure white for any other like kind of regular like citizen on the show, to kind of help differentiate them. And also giving them kind of a little bit more out there hair colors that then matched their special effects. And so yeah, more kind of effects that I helped figure out the color for, and always kind of laying it on the background to just make sure like nothing's like clashing or blending in, that it's like standing out just right. And also we have to figure out like if a character is in a special lighting situation, what exactly that looks like how do the shadows fall, and like how dark are the shadows. So yeah, another painter made like the kind of sunset painting of this location, but I figured out all the color on the characters. So basically, last 17 years, really focused on animation. And it was around the time of working on Duncanville that I was like, okay, I need to just get back into making paintings again for myself. So although I had like a family to focus on as well, I decided like if I can just put just a couple hours a week towards, you know, painting, I'll end up with something eventually. So that's what I did, and literally just pushed around paint. This was made on illustration board, and I was still kind of experimenting then, not really sure what I was doing. But so I first kind of made that like swoosh of colors on the board, and I was like, oh, hey, if I pair this with like a figure, like I can kind of create like a narrative here. And this was made back in 2021, so it was like the height of the pandemic. And I always like infusing kind of humor and tongue-in-cheek sort of ideas into our work. So I like this piece is called Airborne Affection. But I was really happy with where I was going with this, so it just kept going and made more works, acrylic paintings. These were on wood board, and so kind of contrasting a very abstract mark with a realistic figure. So more works, and I was just making these for myself, not really sure like where they would be shown. I would post them online, and sometimes people would purchase them that way, or I also would bring them with me to local art fairs, and sometimes people would collect them by going to an art fair. And these two pieces in particular I had online, and someone liked the kind of idea I had going, like the layout of the one on the left, but they liked the colors of the one on the right, and they actually commissioned me to make a piece for them that kind of showed them and their partner. So this was done with acrylic on wood panel. This is another acrylic piece I did just for myself. It was kind of to commemorate my dog that had passed away. And it was a pretty personal piece, and I didn't really expect like other people to be that into it, but I was just coincidentally invited to participate in a group show benefiting shelter animals. And I was like, okay, I have an appropriate piece, and so I submitted it, and it actually like sold. More acrylic paintings that I did at that time. And this one, so normally with my paintings, I really plan them out, and I'm like, I know exactly what I'm gonna do, but this one, I made that kind of abstract mark, and I had it like sit there for like probably more than a month, and I was like, I think I want to add a figure to it. So kind of just playing around, like, okay, where does the figure appear and where does it disappear? But all along the way, like, I feel like with these newer works, I was kind of pushing the boundary of like, okay, what if I just go totally abstract, which I did do here. And I have to say, like, in now making a few abstract works, like, it actually takes a lot of guts to say like, hey, like, this is my piece, it's done, this is what I want it to be like. Because I felt like having like adding like the human figures in there, it was like a little bit of a crutch of like, okay, well, yeah, I can, draw people, but I don't know, it does take a lot of confidence to like just put out abstract work, but I'm happy, like that's kind of where I landed with this one. But still for fun, I'll draw anime on my own time. So yeah, now kind of using my updated style to draw a Sailor Moon character, and this was done with acrylic wash on paper. So after creating all those works, I was really motivated and I guess inspired to want to kind of put on my own like official gallery show. And in being involved with the Animation Union, actually at their office building, they have a room that members can use, kind of like sign up and use for a month to put on their own show. So that's what I did. And so this was all like self-initiated. I like did all the work to make this even happen, even from like putting up the signage on the glass. But I'm really proud of it. And yeah, it was just up last year. And so I made mostly acrylic pieces that were about 24 inches tall. And with some of these, I actually had like the canvases custom made. So there's like a place in downtown LA, and pretty much like any shaped canvas you can think of, like they'll make it as long as you pay for it. So yeah, I had this kind of custom arched canvas made for that show. And with these pieces, I think I really sort of pushed more of like rendering out more of the image, so then there would be kind of more of a contrast between that and then like that abstract swoosh of colors. And all these pieces also kind of had a storyline going through them, which is why there's like a book there. And the way I work with acrylics, so all these, like I kind of mentioned earlier, everything's planned out in advance, so I tend to draw like kind of the composition and even like kind of rough out colors on the computer in Photoshop. And then once I'm happy with how things are depicted there, then I'll like print out like kind of basically the full-size version to use as a template on the canvas. And I always work back to front. So like the very first thing I'm laying on here is that like flat kind of light gray color, and then whatever's next, which was then like the swoosh of colors, and then kind of working all the way into the foreground. So this made this just for the shows. I came up with a poem to kind of go with the painting. So I made this in like a oversized sketchbook, and I wanted to kind of look like a story, like kind of, kind of like the storybooks you see kind of at the beginning of Disney movies, sort of like that kind of feel. This was the largest piece I made for that show. It was like 3 feet wide, and really like kind of the composition and contrast of like having giving a lot of space kind of to that abstract mark, and then having, you know, contrasting it with a very like highly rendered area. And with a lot of my paintings, I do try and use you know, photo reference wherever I can, but sometimes I don't have exactly the reference I need. And so with this area on the bottom right, I actually kind of like just winged it, and I was like, yeah, I think there's a rock here and a bush there, and I don't know. I was happy with myself to kind of just not have to rely on reference after, I guess, so much experience in painting. Another corner of that show, those are like the smaller works I did on paper, with still with acrylic though. And I even published my own kind of art catalog from that show, just because I was just so proud of what I had done there and didn't really know how it would all be received. But some of these works I did like enter into competitions, and I did gain placement through the Society of Illustrators in their Illustration West competition for this painting. And I also submitted it to like open calls for publications, and so these works were published recently in the catalog called Art Queens. And so then shortly after my solo show went down, I was then invited by a local boutique store in Burbank to kind of show my art there. So a lot of the work I had done earlier that I wasn't really sure where it was going to go ended up getting shown here for like 2 months at this store in Burbank. And okay, so what am I doing now? So as of October of last year, I actually ended work on Crepopolis. So I'm now, as they say in the industry, between jobs. But I'm still keeping busy and doing things for myself. So I haven't really shown a lot of this, but I do still keep up with plein air painting when I can. I do it mostly when I travel. So I kind of now have like a collection of plein air paintings that essentially kind of document where I've been. So like the one on the left was done when I was visiting Idlewild with my family earlier in the year. And then the one on the right I also did in January when the fires broke out, and that's kind of what the scene looked like down the street from me in Glendale. And so besides painting, I've also gotten into making YouTube videos. I felt like I was at a point in my career where maybe I could help people learn something new, and it's particularly in animation, I'm definitely known for my color work, so that's what I focus on in these videos. It's kind of not just like straightforward color theory, it's like telling you stories and like talking about color in a more accessible way. They're called Prism Power. These are some that I have up now, and I figure this is now a good point to tell you where you can find me online. My main website, where I have like my personal artwork and paintings and like blog, and you can find like also notices for events, that's terryhc.art. And I have a separate website for my animation portfolio, which I use to send out when I'm like looking for work or, you know, emailing a recruiter, and that's terryhc.com. And then in terms of social media, you can pretty much find me on any media site under the handle Color Sorceress. And so that is my presentation of my career thus far. Thank you.